So what are we talking about today?
So we're going to be doing a cute little deep dive into international conflict mediation.
Okay, this is going to be a lot, so y'all buckle up.
Yeah.
So after World War I, the world was desperate to prevent another global catastrophe. There was this real push for international peace, and for that, the idea of a new world order emerged.
Which is where the League of Nations comes in. It was the first real attempt at creating an international organization whose main goal was to maintain peace and stop another world war, peacefully if possible.
Yeah, but as we know, it didn't really quite work out. The outbreak of World War II kind of made it clear that the League had failed.
Totally, and that failure is often planned on its flawed structure, no real enforcement power, weak resources, and honestly, a lack of commitment from its member states.
So when World War II was coming to an end and the world was once again in ruins, leaders knew that they needed something better. They needed a stronger organization. This is what led to the birth of the United Nations in 1945.
Representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco between April and June that year. Over 2 months, they drafted the UN Charter, and by October, the UN officially came into being.
And this mission was really simple. It basically wanted to do what the League of Nations couldn't do. They wanted to maintain international peace and security, build cooperation on global issues like human rights and international law.
And the UN has done a lot since then, but the reality is, many of the same problems that plagued the League of Nations are now haunting the UN too.
Yeah, especially when you think about power dynamics. So, the Security Council, for instance, is one of the most powerful bodies in the UN. It's run by 5 permanent members: the US, the UK, China, Russia, and France. They each have veto power.
That veto power can and has been used to protect their own interests, even when those interests clash with peace or justice. It's like giving the referees in a game the power to stop the match whenever they're losing.
Exactly. And the UN's inability to enforce its resolutions, that's a whole nother problem. So whether it's the Rwanda genocide, the war in Syria, Nicaragua versus the United States, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the UN has struggled to act decisively.
Take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The UN has passed resolutions, proposed peace deals, condemned violence, but progress? Minimal.
And this problem, it's deep, it's historical, political, emotional. And every time the UN tries to act, it's either blocked by a veto or undermined by a lack of commitment from powerful states.
And let's not forget, the UN depends on voluntary compliance. They can't actually force countries to follow their resolutions. So when nations ignore international law, there's not much the UN can do.
Even after creating the Genocide Convention in 1948, which literally defines genocide and emphasizes collective action, the UN has failed to hold countries like Israel responsible when accusations arise. This contradiction in itself is really damaging its credibility.
So we're left with this paradox: an organization meant to protect peace and humanity, but one that's often powerless when those values are most at risk. Unless the UN addresses these systemic issues, power imbalances, enforcement limitations, political bias, it risks becoming just another well-intentioned but ineffective organization. The UN was created to be a solution, but maybe it needs its own reform before it can truly solve anything.
And so the big question becomes, how does the structure and design of the United Nations contribute to its ineffectiveness in mediating international disputes as evidenced by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
The United Nations was established in 1945 to maintain global peace and security. But history shows us that the UN struggles to enforce decisions, especially when its most powerful members disagree. Our research focuses on a key case study, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to show just how limited the UN is when it comes to resolving disputes. This study used a qualitative research approach, employing a case study method to examine the complexities of the UN's role in international disputes. We analyzed official UN documents, resolutions, and reports, as well as academic books and journal articles, to gain historical and theoretical insights. Additionally, a comparative media analysis was conducted to examine how different media outlets portray the UN's involvement in conflicts, revealing potential biases and public perceptions. The case study method allowed us to explore real-world examples of UN mediation efforts, including Rwanda, Nicaragua, Syria, and Israel-Palestine to identify patterns of inefficiency. Through thematic analysis, we identified recurring structural barriers preventing the UN from fulfilling its intended role in global peacekeeping and dispute mediation. The study also examined how political interest and institutional constraints within the UN contribute to its limited effectiveness in resolving international disputes. By analyzing past failures, we aim to understand why the UN remains ineffective in enforcing its resolutions and mediating international conflicts.
Before we dive deeper, let's define some important concepts. But first, hey Zoe, what's one word world leaders love to throw around when they don't want anyone interfering in their business?
Tariffs. No, but seriously, sovereignty?
Right. Sovereignty is the right of a state to govern itself without outside interference. And while that's all well and good, it's also one of the biggest barriers to UN enforcement actions. Countries love their independence, but that also means they can ignore international rulings.
Exactly. So it's like when the UN says, hey, stop that, and the country just shrugs and says, make me.
Exactly. And speaking of ignoring warnings, let's talk about genocide. Acts committed with the intent to destroy in a whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. The UN officially recognized genocide in 1948, but fun fact, and by fun I mean horrifying, recognition does not always mean intervention. Rwanda, Syria, yeah, we'll get into that later.
And don't forget international law. It's like regular law, but for countries and with even less enforcement.
Right? It's the set of legal rules governing relations between countries, but without a global police force. Enforcement is kind of a joke.
Oh, and what about international relations? That's the whole study of how countries interact with each other?
Yes. International relations is all about the political, economic, and social interactions between nations. It covers everything from diplomacy and war to trade and human rights. And guess what? The UN is basically the biggest stage where international relations play out. Sometimes successfully, but often, well, not so much. So, with all of that in mind, let's set some expectations. This study is limited in scope. While we acknowledge that the UN has had humanitarian successes, we're focusing on its failures in conflict mediation.
One major limitation, the lack of primary resources. We're not using direct testimonies from individuals who were involved in the international conflict. And we're not actually looking at people who have received aid from the UN. There's also this issue of perspective. Since this study focuses on how the UN hasn't been effective, we're not really covering the times when it has worked.
Right. Like, we're not talking about the UN's role in delivering humanitarian aid after disasters, or its peacekeeping missions that have been relatively successful.
So that means our conclusion might not be fully balanced. We're zoning in on the failures, and in doing so, we might miss the bigger picture of the organization's full capabilities.
But that's also part of the research design. The questions we're asking are focused on failure, not the entire performance of the UN.
Now, at this point, we've said a lot. We've given you a full history of the UN, and you're probably starting to get daydreams of turning this video off. And you're thinking to yourself, why should I even care?
Well, this study is significant because it dives into the role the United Nations plays in global diplomacy and conflict resolution, especially in one of the most complex and long-standing disputes, the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yeah, and by focusing on that, we're not just talking about one situation. We're also exposing some of the UN's deepest issues, like its structure and design flaws that limit its ability to actually make a difference.
Exactly. These aren't just surface-level problems. They're systemic, and they really affect how well the UN can mediate conflicts and encourage meaningful dialogue.
And while the Israel-Palestine conflict is the lens we're using, the implications go way beyond that. What we learned here could apply to how the UN functions in other global crises too.
That's why the findings of this research could actually help shape policy. If we can pinpoint where the UN is falling short, we can start to think about how to fix it, how to reform the way it approaches mediation.
At this point, we've set the stage with Chapter 1. We've introduced the UN's growing ineffectiveness in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, we're going to present a literature review on the UN's structure and shortcomings in various conflicts, leading into our case study on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while Chapter 3 will apply collective theory and dominant-subordinate group theory to explain why the UN struggles to mediate such conflict disputes, concluding with an in-depth analysis and final insights. Obviously, to discuss the UN effectively, we've got to break down its structure. The UN has 6 main organs: the General Assembly, the Secretary Council, the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, the Trustee Council, and the Secretary. Each has a specific role, but they don't always work in harmony. The General Assembly includes every member state with 1 vote each. It debates and votes on major issues, but its decisions aren't binding. Then there's the Security Council. It's the UN's most powerful body, meant to maintain global peace. But here's the problem. Only 5 permanent members, China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, have veto power. 1 veto from any of them can block action, even in the face of a humanitarian crisis. The Economic and Social Council tackles global development. The International Court of Justice settles disputes but can be ignored. The Secretariat handles peacekeeping research and aid. And the Trustee Council is pretty much inactive today. So what's the issue? According to scholars like Thomas West, the UN is trapped by its own structure, state sovereignty, and equality. Between rich and poor countries, internal bureaucracy, and outdated leadership models, all contribute to its ineffectiveness. The Security Council, for example, hasn't been reformed in decades. It doesn't reflect today's global power dynamics, and it gives too much control to few countries. In cases like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the UN often appears powerless. Vetoes and political interests override peace efforts, and without enforcement, international law becomes a suggestion, not a standard. If the UN wants to remain relevant in a globalized future, structural reform is essential, because peace can't just be promised, it has to be protected. And something to keep in mind is that after World War I, the League of Nations was formed to keep the peace, but the U.S. never joined. That's something that people often overlook, but it's probably one of the reasons the League of Nations eventually collapsed. It just didn't have the global strength that it needed, especially without a major power like the U.S. on board. Fast forward to 1945, the United Nations is established, this time with U.S. involvement right after World War II. Just 3 years later, in 1948, the UN plays a crucial role in the formation of the State of Israel. But that decision also meant displacing thousands of Palestinians to what was supposed to be a separate Arab state. And here we are, decades later, still negotiating peace, still watching the same conflict unfold. It really makes you wonder, did the UN help solve a problem, or did it create one it's been trying to fix ever since?
How does this structural failure play out in the real world? Let's examine 5 major case studies.
So, it's actually 4, not 5. Somebody just can't count.
Rwanda, Nicaragua, Syria, and Israel-Palestine. Each of these conflicts provides crucial insights into the limitations of the UN's mediation efforts, whether due to political deadlock, lack of enforcement power, or a geopolitical interest overriding humanitarian concerns.
Let's start with one of the most infamous failures of the United Nations, the Rwandan genocide. In just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were murdered in one of the fastest and most brutal genocides in modern history. The UN had peacekeepers on the ground, United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, but they were not given the mandate to intervene militarily. The warning signs were everywhere. The UN was aware that Hutu extremists were preparing for mass killings, and a top UN official, Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, even requested permission to confiscate weapons caches before the violence erupted. The UN's response? They told him not to intervene. When the genocide began, the Security Council's reaction was to reduce its presence in Rwanda. Yes, instead of increasing peacekeeping forces, they cut the UNAMIR force from 2,500 to just 270 troops. The reasoning? Nations like the US and France didn't want to get involved after the disastrous US intervention in Somalia the previous year. So, instead of stopping the genocide, the UN ended up evacuating foreign nationals and just watch as mass killings unfolded. It wasn't until July 1994, when the Rwandan Patriotic Front overthrew the government, that the genocide ended, not because of the UN intervention, but because of military action taken by Rwandan forces themselves. The Rwandan genocide remains one of the most damning examples of UN inaction. exposing how veto-wielding nations can prevent necessarily military intervention, even in the face of clear warnings of mass atrocities.
Nicaragua. The Nicaragua versus United States case is a perfect example of the UN's legal limitations when dealing with powerful nations. This case went before the International Court of Justice after Nicaragua accused the U.S. of violating international law by funding, training, and arming Contra rebels who sought to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Additionally, the U.S. was found to have mined Nicaraguan harbors, an act of aggression that violated Nicaragua's sovereignty and disrupted its economy. The ICJ ruled in favor of Nicaragua, stating that the U.S. had indeed breached international law and needed to cease its actions and pay reparations. But we know how the U.S. gets down with reparations. The U.S. outright rejected the ruling and refused to comply. Making matters worse, the U.S. used its veto power in the UN Security Council to block any enforcement measures against itself. Essentially, the UN's highest legal body ruled against the U.S., but the U.S. was able to just ignore it because they were on the Security Council. The U.S. even withdrew from the ICJ's compulsory jurisdiction to prevent similar cases in the future. This case highlighted a major flaw in the UN system. There is no real enforcement mechanism for ICJ rulings, especially when a Security Council member is involved. This case set a dangerous precedent. Powerful nations can violate international law and face no consequences if they have enough political influence. Nicaragua technically won the case, but in reality, it gained nothing because there was no way to enforce the ruling.
The Syrian war is one of the deadliest and most complex conflicts of the 21st century, and it serves as another major failure of the UN's conflict resolution efforts. Since the war began in 2011, more than 500,000 people have been killed and millions have been displaced. Despite this, the UN has been largely paralyzed due to political divisions within the Security Council. The conflict began as part of the Arab uprisings when Syrians protested against the government of Bashar al-Assad. These demonstrations were met with brutal government crackdowns, leading to a full-scale civil war. The situation escalated into a complex proxy war involving multiple factions, including Syrian opposition groups, Kurdish forces, ISIS, and foreign powers such as Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the United States. The UN attempted multiple peace efforts, but nearly all failed. The biggest obstacle, Russia and China repeatedly used their veto power to block Security Council resolutions aimed at condemning the Assad regime or imposing sanctions. Initially, in August 2011, the UN issued a presidential statement expressing concern about the crisis, condemning human rights violations, and urging an end to the violence. However, this statement lacked any enforceable action. When the Security Council attempted to pass a resolution condemning the Syrian government's use of force, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, Lebanon, and India opposed it, stalling any action. Then came the European draft resolution, which used stronger language than the presidential statement. But Russia and China vetoed the resolution, ensuring it never passed. Even when Russia and China later proposed their own draft resolution, it wasn't even out to a vote by the Security Council. By February 2012, Arab states and Western countries attempted again to push for UN action, but Russia and China vetoed it once more. In February 2012, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was appointed as the UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria. He developed a 6-point peace plan calling for a ceasefire, humanitarian aid, and the release of detainees. Initially, the Syrian government accepted the plan and agreed to a ceasefire on April 12, 2012. However, the ceasefire quickly collapsed and violence escalated again. In response, the UN Security Council adopted resolutions 2042 and 2043, which condemned human rights violations and authorized unarmed military observers to monitor the situation. But when their mandates expired, the decision to extend them was once again vetoed by Russia and China. By August 2012, Annan resigned in frustration as the violence worsened, resulting in over 10,000 civilian deaths by that point alone. His resignation symbolized the UN's inability to enforce even its own negotiated agreements. So, just like in previous conflicts, the UN ended up issuing statements and sending unarmed observers, but failing to stop the violence itself. Even when UN investigators confirmed war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons on civilians, no meaningful action was taken due to the Security Council's gridlock. The Syrian civil war exposed how the UN's decision-making process can be completely paralyzed by veto power. Russia, in particular, uses influence to protect Assad, providing military support to his regime. This alliance was not just about Syria. It was a broader strategy to prevent Western countries and NATO from intervening, similar to what happened in Libya. Not only did the veto power prevent action, but it also expressed the political biases and strategic alliances that shape UN decision-making. The UN Security Council's paralysis in Syria raised serious questions about its legitimacy. If permanent members can block any resolution based on national interest rather than humanitarian concerns, then the UN's ability to maintain global peace is fundamentally compromised. And that's the bigger issue, right? If the Security Council continues to allow veto power to override human rights concerns, then the UN will struggle to enforce its own ruling and fulfill its mission of securing international peace. The Syrian civil war is one of the most striking examples of how the UN can be rendered powerless when powerful nations prioritize political alliances over humanitarian intervention. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is central to our research because it highlights the core weaknesses of the UN's mediation efforts. The conflict has persisted for decades despite numerous UN resolutions, ceasefire agreements, and peace negotiations. To fully understand the UN's role and its limitations, we will focus on key historical moments, major UN interventions, and the Security Council's repeated failures to enforce resolutions. The United Nations' involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dates back to 1947, when the UN proposed Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, which aimed to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international zone. While Jewish leaders accepted the plan, Arab leaders rejected it, leading to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. After the war, Israel declared independence, expanding beyond their original partition borders, while hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, leading to an ongoing refugee crisis. In response, the UN created the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, in 1949, tasked with providing aid to Palestinian refugees. However, the UN's efforts to mediate a lasting resolution largely failed, as conflict erupted again in the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, each further entrenching territorial disputes. Since the 1960s, the UN has passed numerous resolutions addressing the conflict. Some of the most critical include Resolution 242 in 1967. This calls for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace. This became the foundation for later peace efforts but was never fully implemented. Resolution 338 in 1973 urged a ceasefire following Yom Kippur War and called for negotiations based on Resolution 242. Resolution 478 in 1980 declared Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem illegal. Israel ignored this resolution and no enforcement action was taken. Resolution 2334 in 2016 condemned Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories as violations of international law. The U.S. abstained from this vote instead of vetoing it, allowing the resolution to pass, but with no enforcement mechanism. These resolutions reflect the UN's repeated attempts to address the conflict, but without enforcement power, they remain symbolic. Israel continues to expand settlements in the West Bank, a move condemned by the UN but never stopped due to the lack of action from the Security Council. A major obstacle to UN intervention is the United States' consistent use of its veto power to block resolutions critical of Israel. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has vetoed over 50 resolutions addressing Israeli actions in the occupied territories. This diplomatic protection allows Israel to continue policies that contradict UN rulings without facing consequences. Meanwhile, Palestinian representatives have attempted to gain full UN membership, but their efforts have been blocked primarily by U.S. opposition. The result? A diplomatic deadlock where the UN Security Council cannot act effectively, leaving the General Assembly to pass non-binding resolutions that lack enforcement mechanisms.
In this chapter, we're going to dive headfirst into the theoretical frameworks that are going to power our research. These frameworks will help us to break down the big issue at hand, why the United Nations isn't quite living up to the hype.
We've got two heavy hitters on the docket, the dominant and subordinate group theory and game theory. Think of them as our secret weapons for unpacking the UN's global missteps and shedding light on why it's not always the peacekeeper we hope it would be.
When we're talking about the dominant and subordinate group theory, to really understand this in the context of international organizations like the United Nations, you first have to kind of grasp that concept and how it plays out in everyday life.
Right. Social inequality is everywhere. Even when people have the same qualifications, a white man might make more money than a black woman. This isn't just about individual interactions. It happens within institutions too, right?
Right, and that's where this theory comes in. It's not just about individuals. It's about entire groups being systematically advantaged while others are kept at a disadvantage. And the dominant groups often don't want to give up their power to help these subordinate groups achieve equity.
Yeah, and that's the big issue. We see it with the UN too. The power dynamics at play really affect this social hierarchy.
So this theory, this social dominance, kind of this inner theory under what we're saying, says that humans are naturally inclined to create and maintain social hierarchies. In 1999, Sidonus and Prado examined in their book Social Dominance and what they called the arbitrary set system.
The arbitrary set system is all about social hierarchies. It's based on things like caste, ethnicity, and religion.
And in the UN, we see this arbitrary set in action. The Security Council is a perfect example. It reflects the post-World War II power dynamics, and it hasn't really adapted to the global power structure as it is today.
And this brings us to one of the key processes of the social dominance theory, behavioral asymmetry. Essentially, it shows how dominant groups and subordinate groups behave differently based on their power, and often the subordinate groups even reinforce those inequalities.
Yeah, and with the Security Council, the permanent members like the US, China, and Russia, they hold all of this veto power. This makes it really hard to challenge their decisions or to enforce anything on them, even when they're clearly abusing that power. For instance, in Nicaragua versus the United States, this is a perfect example. The UN couldn't even hold the US accountable because the power dynamics made it impossible. It was essentially like a child trying to discipline a parent. Cute, but useless.
And that's the problem. The current system based on these outdated power structures perpetuates inequality. The permanent members fight to keep their power, and the non-permanent members, whether willingly or not, concede to it.
And that's why the UN can't be as effective as it should be. And so when we apply the dominant and subordinate group theory, it becomes really clear that the power dynamics within the UN are a huge reason why it struggles to function effectively. The permanent members maintain their power, and this discrimination is baked into the system. After all, when have you ever heard of the powerful giving up their power for equality?
I haven't. The way the UN is structured, it can't truly push for fairness and equality because of these entrenched hierarchies. It's a clear example of how power distribution in international organization impacts their effectiveness. Alright, let's talk about game theory, which despite its name is not about video games. Though honestly, the United Nations does feel like a game sometimes, just one where nobody ever wins.
Yeah, it's more like this really bad multiplayer strategy game where some players have cheat codes, others don't bother to read the instructions, and a few just rage quit mid-match.
Say it louder for those in the back. Game theory is a mathematical framework that helps explain strategic decision-making between different players, whether they're world leaders, businesses, or, in our case, countries trying and failing to solve international disputes.
In the UN, it's definitely failing.
So how does this apply to the UN? Well, imagine the UN Security Council as a high-stakes poker game. Each country at the table, especially the permanent 5, US, UK, China, Russia, and France, isn't just playing for world peace. They're playing to protect their own interests. This classic scenario called the prisoner's dilemma, where two players can either cooperate for mutual benefit or betray each other for personal gain. The logical choice, cooperate. The realistic choice, betray. Every single time.
So in the UN, instead of cooperating for world peace, you have countries acting based on their self-interest.
Bingo! Take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The UN passed countless resolutions calling for peace, but the US almost always vetoes anything crucial to Israel. Why? Because supporting Israel aligns with its strategic alliances, economic interests, and domestic political considerations.
And this isn't just random. This is exactly what game theory predicts. The Security Council structure incentivizes non-cooperation because each major power calculates that blocking resolutions are going to serve its interests more than allowing progress.
And then there's Russia with Syria, blocking every resolution that threatens Assad because Syria is a key military ally and strategic foothold in the Middle East. But let's zoom in on to Israel-Palestine, because this case is basically game theory 101.
Right, because both sides view the conflict as a zero-sum game. If one side gains, the other automatically loses. There's no perception of mutual benefit, which means
nobody wants to compromise. Game theory shows us that even when states believe negotiations will weaken them, they will refuse to engage, even when cooperation could lead to long-term stability.
And because the UN operates within this web of competing national interests, it gets really caught up in this cycle of selective intervention. So conflicts that align with the interests of major powers, they get action, while others like Israel-Palestine, they get stuck in this endless deadlock.
Exactly. A study of Security Council action shows that conflicts involving major powers receive far more resolutions and enforcement than those with less geopolitical weight, meaning the UN's hands are often tied. Not by its mission, but by those who hold the power to act. This is where power dynamics and game theory come in. The permanent members of the Security Council, particularly the US, dictate the rules of the game.
So even though the UN was designed to be this neutral mediator, game theory explains why it fails to function that way. Because the real players aren't the negotiators, they're the powerful states pulling the strings.
Right. And if you really want to make things messy, let's throw external actors into the mix. Regional rivalries, alliances, and even media influence further complicate the negotiation process.
So now we have this combination of state interests, historical grievances, geopolitical alliances, and media narratives all feeding into the same game theory nightmare.
And what's worse? The rise of social media and digital activism has made things even more unpredictable. Now, public perception influences diplomacy in ways that weren't even possible before. Which means that even when the UN does try to act, the court of public opinion can sway how effective those actions are. So to sum it all up,
the UN is trapped in a game of competing state interest where veto power ensures that resolutions align with major powers, not humanitarian needs. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a textbook example of zero-sum game where both sides refuse to compromise and external powers reinforce the deadlock. The UN Security Council prioritizes conflicts based on geopolitical stakes, not on urgency or human rights violations.
And I guess that brings us back to our main problem. Is the United Nations truly effective as an international organization? And from the structure and design, I think it's becoming fairly clear what the answer is. To truly get to the bottom of this, I think we better take a look at some of the United Nations' biggest failures, and what's a better case study for this than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's start with the beginning. And in the beginning, well, not that far back. In 1947, the United Nations put forward what was meant to be a solution, the partition plan. The idea was to divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under its international control. It was an ambitious plan, but ultimately, it completely ignored the realities on the ground. What does this look like to you?
Inequality!
Obviously, Arab leaders rejected this plan. They argued that it unfairly favored the Jewish population, which owned about 7% of the land, but they were allocated a whopping 55% under the proposal.
That's actually so insane. So that would mean that even though the Jewish population was considerably less, they would have more land than the Palestinians. That is not really a fair deal.
Exactly. Therein lies the problem. Violence erupted almost immediately. By 1948, when Israel declared independence, neighboring Arab states intervened, and the first Arab-Israeli war soon began afterwards.
So the big plan the UN created failed and was unable to prevent the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
Fast forward to 1967, the Six-Day War begins and Israel takes control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The UN responds with Resolution 242, calling for Israel's immediate withdrawal from occupied territories. And of course, this was respected and they left immediately. That actually never happened. Instead, there was decades of negotiations, resolutions, and peace talks that followed, but the occupation remained and, even worse, expanded. Now, don't get us wrong. The United Nations did condemn the Israeli settlement building. Resolutions like 2334 in 2016 reaffirmed that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories was illegal. But condemnation is one thing, action is another. The UN had no real power to enforce these rulings, especially when key Security Council members, the United States, used their veto power to shield Israel from any of their consequences. The situation escalated by October 7th of 2023 and continued into 2024 with repeated conflicts in Gaza, rising settler violence in the West Bank, and thousands of casualties. The UN was quick to respond, and 193 UN members officially recognized a Palestinian state. But once again, the Security Council proved to be the biggest roadblock. The United Nations and a few allies refused to back full U.S. membership for Palestine, effectively maintaining the status quo. Now we've reached January 2025. After months of violence, a ceasefire was finally brokered by mediators. But by March 18th, Israel was back to launching what they called preemptive airstrikes.
So, is there a ceasefire still? And what is the UN's role in all of this?
As of today, it hasn't been officially declared over, but given these attacks by Israel, the truce is done. And the harsh truth is this. The UN played only a minor role. The main mediators were Egypt, Qatar, and the US.
So regional actors, not the United Nations, led the negotiations?
Yeah, but again, don't get me wrong. The UN did support this with Resolution 2735, which called for Hamas to accept a proposed hostage and ceasefire agreement in the ongoing Gaza war. This resolution, presented by the United States, detailed a three-phase proposal and had Israel's acceptance. The implementation of the described agreement was supposed to result in the release of all hostages held by Hamas, establish a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and included a multi-year reconstruction plan. Additionally, the resolution would have rejected any demographic or territorial changes in the Gaza Strip and reaffirmed the Security Council's support for a two-state solution, leading to the unification of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank under Palestinian Authority government, which would have been a great plan, but it didn't work.
So essentially, what we've learned is that the UN cannot enforce peace, cannot stop illegal occupations, and cannot overcome the Security Council deadlock.
And the mic drop moment you've all been waiting for? The United Nations is in fact ineffective at mediating international conflicts given its structure and design as exemplified by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just one example, but it speaks to a bigger issue. Can the United Nations still fulfill its mission? Or has it become little more than a stage for diplomatic theatrics?
Yeah, and to be clear, there really is no right answer. I mean, is the answer supposed to be that the UN just disbands and throw out all of its humanitarian aid and efforts that they are able to actually provide? That doesn't really sound like a solution to me. So while the UN is ineffective in some international dealings, it still does meaningful work.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. With a little bit of shaping and reconstructing, it could eventually accomplish its mission of establishing world peace and security.
Exactly, and there are a lot of great ideas that have been put forth by scholars and leaders alike. For example, the first thing that would have to happen is a complete and utter Security Council reform. Literally, just scrape the whole thing. This whole veto power thing, literally this supermajority, all of this stuff has to go. This one proposal requires a supermajority rather than a single veto to block resolutions.
I like that, that aid, yeah. I've also heard about ways to adjunct their peaceful enforcement. The UN needs more than just peacekeeping missions. It needs mechanisms to impose consequences for violations of international law. Economic sanctions or legal accountability could be coordinated more effectively to deter ongoing conflicts.
That makes so much sense. They could also use stronger funding and independence. Right now, the major powers influence the UN by controlling its funding. A more sustainable and independent financial model could really allow the UN to operate without political strings attached.
Ultimately, the United Nations was created to prevent war, protect human rights, and uphold international law. But without meaningful reform, it risks becoming obsolete.
But thankfully, we're not there yet. With some restructuring in its design, the UN could really be improved and become an effective international organization.
So, any questions?